Hi, welcome to session 3 of the fifth topic of the semester, Texas from nationhood to statehood, 1836 all the way to 1860. So we're going to be dealing with, again, a period of time in Texas history that Texas is going to fully form its independent state, republic, dealing with the problems of the republic and looking at the process of annexation into the United States and how also Texas was accommodating to the status of statehood in the American Union from 1845 when it was annexed all the way to 1860. That's pretty much when the Civil War is going to break out. So the Civil War will be assessed. It will be examined in a separate topic coming after this one in the sixth topic of the semester. So far we have covered two sessions dealing with the rise of the Texas Republic and the structures of the Texas government, how it was organized, the territories, and looking at some of the first administrations, political administrations. President Houston, President Lamar were examined there. They have different policies that they carried out in order to form, to shape the nation of Texas economically and also politically. So we covered that quite fully in the previous topic, and we were also looking also in the second in the first session. I'm sorry, in the first session we covered that, and in the second session we're looking also again at the transition stages, if you will, that are going to take Texas into the process of annexation as well. Looking at Texas society, for example, we examine the different social groupings of Texas that lived during this time. Many of them are immigrant groups that are entering Texas to colonize it, becoming quite diverse. Texas society, ethnically speaking, there's European groups coming from many different regions of Europe coming into Texas through the process of colonization laws, etc. who are looking at that as well. There's going to be more Americans, of course, coming into Texas as well. There's going to be also, the increasing presence of African slaves that are brought by Americans to East Texas, particularly, and the plantations that are established there, cotton plantations. And we're also looking also at the Tejanos, the Mexican heritage, a population called Tejanos. Those are the Mexican, if you will, people of Mexican descent, Mexican heritage, living in the South, particularly in the southern portion of Texas, in places like Goliad, for example, San Antonio, Laredo, etc. We were looking at that as well. And we were looking also at the economy of the Texas Republic, what kind of enterprises, were flourishing in those years, like small farms, for example. We're looking at small farms. We're looking at cotton plantations, cattle ranching, etc. We're, again, assessing that, particularly in the second session. But in this session, now we're going to be moving into this process of annexation. There's going to be the process of bringing Texas closer and closer to the United States. Finally, there's going to be an annexation bill that welcomed Texas as a new member in the Union, the United States. And with that, this is, again, going to set off a conflict with Mexico, dealing, again, with the issue of Texas itself, whether Texas was part of Mexico or not, because the United States annexed, again, Texas when Mexico did not recognize the independence of Texas, and how this is going to lead to, again, diplomatic tensions between the United States and Mexico, leading up to a war called the Mexican-American War that spanned, roughly speaking, 2 or 3 years max again, and ended up, again, with Mexico being defeated. And we're going to see, again, the transfer of territories to the United States. Additional lands will be transferred to the United States. And this is where we're going to cover that. And of course, in this session, we're also going to look at statehood, the years when Texas was experiencing the transition towards statehood, being part of the United States, and how Texas society looked like during this transition period. Again, all of that will be covered in this session. Now, let's turn to our slide now in order to now move forward with the material dealing with annexation and the U.S.-Mexican War. Okay, so this is extremely important, again, because we're going to see that the annexation of Texas was due to a set of reasons or factors that troubled the new Texas Republic, and they're going to see that annexation was, the best possible solution to some of the problems that Texas was experiencing. But in this process, when Texas becomes part of the United States, this is going to lead to a war with Mexico from 1845 to 48. That is going to, of course, bring significant change to the region, again, of we call the American Southwest, something that will be annexed, by the United States. Territories that were part of Mexico will be now ceded to the United States. Okay, so let's look at the process of annexation. Again, Texas annexation into the U.S., something that finally culminated in 1845, but the annexation itself, the petitions, if you will, that the Texas Republic was sending to Washington, D.C., was not something new. I discussed this in session 2, that Texas was petitioning to be annexed into the American Union ever since 1836, again, when Texas became independent. So this is, a desire by many of the peoples that live in Texas, particularly the American population. Again, the Americans that live here, they desire to be part of the Union. Okay, so this is something that had been going on ever since independence, but finally culminated in 1845. So what is the background? What is the background of Texas annexation? What led to, the decision by the Texas Republic to desire, again, to be part of the Union instead of remaining an independent country, a republic with its own constitution, its own laws, etc. What led Texas to, consider annexation as more beneficial? So this decision was particularly driven initially by finances. Again, the finances of the new republic were not all that in a very well positioned, because Texas remained with a debt. There's a foreign debt to be repaid, for example. Because of independence, it borrowed Texas monies again from creditors. Some of them were Americans, others were Europeans, etc. That needed to repay. And also, there was also the issue of economic development. Texas needed to develop an economic system that will generate enterprises for the people to build wealth that will actually produce more and more property that will be taxable by the nation of Texas, in order for the nation of Texas to use those revenues to pay for all their expenses. That is to say, so you need to create enterprises, because this is the way that people are going to build up wealth, revenues you can collect from taxes, etc. In order to pay for administrative dues, you need to pay for administrators, for the military, for the functioning of the country as a whole. So you need to develop an economy. That is to say, so initially it was a financial, condition, that they don't have the monies to develop their economies, to pay for their administrations, etc. And initially they were actually trying to borrow money. Okay. Texas was in this precarious condition that it was actually attempting to borrow the money, particularly from Europeans, again, in order to invest it in Texas, in order to, again, pretty much kickstart the economy, if you will, to, get the economy going, to build a national economy. Remember, Texas is a nation. So Texas was seeking the support of the Europeans in terms of trying to obtain loans, again, from European countries. And of course, that involved, of course, getting recognition. Okay, so you just gain independence from Mexico, but Mexico doesn't recognize you. But if you get Europeans to recognize you, for example, the nations of Europe, then you can now acquire the status of an independent state. And with that recognition, you can actually create treaties, you create arrangements with other nations in order for them to assist you financially to invest in your country, to attract investors, in other words, to build enterprises, etc. That's what you want. So Texas was dealing with that issue again, trying to, borrow monies. Initially, the ideal was to borrow $5 million. Again, and they're looking for a $5 million loan in order to invest it again in the economy, and they were trying to obtain recognition. Which, of course, in 1939, the nation of France actually extended recognition to the Texas Republic, and in the following year, in 1840, Holland and England also extended recognition as well, even though the monies are not necessarily being obtained necessarily in great numbers in order to develop the economy. But initially, again, this whole issue, the background that led to the desire for annexation was financial. Again, they're in financial distress. Okay, the Texas administration. But there's also going to be another source of stress that is going to exert significant pressure on the Texas Republic, that the Texas Republic feels that the only way to deal with this pressure is to be annexed by the United States, because the United States was going to extend, of course, protection. Protection from what? From Mexico, okay? Because the country of Mexico does not recognize, okay, the Texas Republic, okay? This is going to be a situation that remained pretty much permanent ever since Santa Anna returned to Mexico with the Treaty of Velasco, in which he actually recognized, of course, the independence of Texas. The situation is that Santa Anna does not extend recognition, nor the presidents of Mexico that are in Mexico City, of course, ruling Mexico. They don't extend recognition again to Texas. Texas is simply a province, a state of Mexico in a state of revolt, a state of rebellion, which, by the way, there are other regions of Mexico that are also in a state of open rebellion and open revolt. So Mexico is not really recognizing the independence of all those regions. It's just say they're just simply, again, in resistance, if you will. So Mexico considers Texas still part of Mexico. Okay, that's very important. And again, there's going to be frictions, of course, with Mexico over that issue, particularly because Mexico is trying to exert their control over Texas. It's not just that they're denying recognition from afar, but the Mexican politicians in Mexico City, whether it's Santana and all the other officials, are trying to exert influence in Texas and perhaps even gain it back. There will be attempts by doing that by Mexico, such as, for example, Mexico is going to build an alliance with the Cherokee Indians of Texas in order to incite instability, okay? Using the Cherokees, if you will, as agents of instability, okay? There are, of course, incidents that tell about the involvement of Mexican officials like Vicente Cordova and Manuel Flores at the border, between Texas and Mexico, that they're actually the ones reaching out to the Cherokees, trying to provide weaponry to them and trying to incite a revolt. The Cherokees are involved in raiding, for example, settlements in Texas, etc. And instead of invading Texas directly, in many cases, what the government of Mexico is using is simply using the Native Americans, like the Cherokees, for example. So there is that incident of Vicente Cordova and Manuel Flores, again, inciting the Cherokees to create instability in Texas, again, to destabilize, in other words, to destabilize the Texas government, if you will, to make it vulnerable, and in due time, simply, again, retake Texas in the process. There's also, of course, other incidents that bring frictions with Mexico that are actually initiated by the Lamar administration. President Lamar, who succeeds Sam Houston, okay, in 1939, is going to also clash with the government of Mexico when he's attempting to gain control of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Santa Fe, New Mexico, by the way, is still up to this point part of Mexico. Is in the province, in the state of New Mexico, and there are territorial disputes between the Texas Republic and Mexico concerning the western border. The Lamar administration wants to extend the border to include Santa Fe, and so he sends in 1841 an expedition there in order to seize Santa Fe, this little town, which was really a center for trade that connected California and overseas trade, and of course Texas and the United States. It was just in the middle, if you will, of a corridor of trade, of goods flowing back and forth, and Lamar simply wants to seize that, of course, and with that, of course, is going to create a state of tension with the government of Mexico, of course, as he's sending, of course, an expedition to Santa Fe. The soldiers are going to be actually captured beforehand by Mexican forces, and this small expedition is going to be sent to Mexico City. They're going to be imprisoned, okay? Texas soldiers are going to now be imprisoned by Mexico in Mexico proper again. So there is that diplomatic, issue, that Texas, the independent republic, has failed in this expedition, but the soldiers themselves, they're Americans again, that are Texas citizens, okay, are now in Mexico. They're in prison, of course. So this creates frictions again with Mexico, because it was evident again that Texas had ambitions to expand, if you will, territorially westward. Again, this was something that Lamar was very much adamant about, more so than Sam Houston, but Lamar was so adamant of getting taking New Mexico. So the other, of course, incident that creates frictions with Mexico is Santa Anna's attempt to regain Texas by crossing the Rio Grande River and moving troops all the way to San Antonio, Texas. Okay, so the city, the town, it's called the town. The town of San Antonio is going to be captured, actually, momentarily, by the way. This is not going to be a permanent occupation. Is simply defying the republic by sending troops, crossing the Rio Grande, and trying to regain or reclaim, better stated, the Rio Grande Valley. So the entire Rio Grande Valley, again, is going to be claimed by Santa Anna as to be simply part of Mexico, that the border between Texas and Mexico is not really the Rio Grande. Santa Anna insists that this is not the border, again, that divides Mexico and Texas, the Rio Grande, that is to say, the way it is today By the way, when you go to Mexico, you have to go to the Rio Grande and cross the Rio Grande into Mexico. But we're going to talk about this in a few moments, that the original border, according to the Spanish Empire that colonized this region and the Mexican Republic of 1824, in some of the treaties that were signed, indicated that the border of Texas was the Nueces River, far more to the north of the Rio Grande. So there was this whole strip of land, again, that is going to be disputed, as we'll see, between Texas and Mexico. And Santana simply defined, Texas by simply moving troops across the Rio Grande, capturing momentarily the Rio Grande Valley, saying this part of Mexico, now actually capturing San Antonio, because Texas is part of Mexico, and reclaims, again, makes a proclamation there in San Antonio that this is, of course, part of Mexico, etc., and leaves San Antonio. So this is mind-boggling, that this is not a permanent occupation. He's not really inviting, of course, direct confrontation with the Texas forces necessarily at this point, to the point that he actually retreats. He leaves San Antonio. Perhaps he's just testing the waters, etc., to see what will happen and the like. But as he leaves San Antonio, Sam Houston is going to recapture San Antonio, and of course the town of Laredo as well, in the very border, in the Rio Grande River again. The Rio Grande, again, that divides Mexico and Texas. Laredo is also going to be reclaimed by Sam Houston, of course. So what this is leading up to is that there's now a back and forth, if you will, between the Texas Republic and Mexico, as to they're testing the waters to see if indeed this is an independent state that is going to have the capacity to defend their own independence, their own sovereignty, or is this just simply a region that is not fully independent? They're trying to build a state, is trying to build a national economy, but they're unable. They're still weak, and Mexico is simply trying to push around, if you will, Texas, to see if this is going to be a country to reckon with or not. And some of the region that is going to be highly contested is precisely the border itself, particularly the Rio Grande Valley. Again, that strip of land that stretches from, let's say, to the very east in what today is Matamoros, for example, the city of Matamoros in Mexico, and what today is the town of Brownsville, all the way to Corpus Christi, and all that strip of land moving all the way to San Antonio. Again, it's a strip of land across the border that is going to be contested, disputed during that 9-10 year period of Texas independence. So again, this leads to the desire really to exert a more aggressive policy. There are Texans that want to really, again, challenge Mexico and trying to seize control of this strip of land, the Rio Grande Valley, by now not only sending troops to this region, but even trying to cross the border into Mexico itself, and trying to perhaps even push the boundary, what they call the boundary, the Rio Grande, even to the south, that maybe the boundary of Texas and Mexico is south of the Rio Grande. So let's take a few towns, they said, again, in the Mexican side, just to see what Mexico will do. Now, this is like the reverse position. Texas is now going to send an expedition called the Mier expedition, because there's a town, a Mexican town called Mier, that Texas wants to occupy. This is now in Mexico proper, by the way, and the Texans are going to move to the border, capture the town. But once again, this is going to be a failed expedition as well, just like the Santa Fe expedition. Likewise, again, Texas troops are going to be captured again at the border as they're trying to seize this town. There will be Mexican troops there, and they're going to capture the members of the expedition, of this Texas expedition, Americans, of course, are participating here. They're Texas citizens, by the way. And they're going to be imprisoned, and some of them are going to be executed. Okay, so it's not just imprisonment. Now they're going to be executed. Not the entire expeditionary, the expedition, the force, but they're going to select, some of them for execution. So again, Mexico is also responding in quite an aggressive way against the incursions, the expeditions that the Texans are implementing on the border, whether they're trying to seize, of course, certain towns or move across the Rio Grande into Mexico, etc. So this is going to be a highly contested territory, the border itself. Okay. So because of those two reasons, was financial, the Texas Republic is really unable to fully kickstart the economy. They're doing their best, by the way. They're doing their best, but they don't feel that they're moving at the rate that they wish to be moving, economically speaking. So they still have a lot of expenses, a lot of dues, and they don't feel that they have attracted significant foreign investment into Texas. And of course, there's the frictions with Mexico. Okay, Mexico at this time, of course, will have a larger force. That if Mexico was willing to use it, they could simply send it to Texas. Of course, Mexico is not doing that. But what the Texans have learned is that they're not going to be able to deal with the Mexican army. Okay, they just don't have the capacity. They don't have the numbers. They don't have the technology, for example. This is not to say that Mexico was highly technological in their equipment or in their armament, etc. This is not to say that, but in terms of numbers, they're again they outnumber the Texans, and that's very evident from the Santa Fe and the Mir expeditions. So again, there's going to be, of course, now increasing anxiety and an increasing sense of insecurity by the Texas citizens that the only way to develop their economies, to have financial security, investment, more economic development, enterprises, etc., and also military security, that the way to go is annexation. Again, this is going to be the fast track, again, to obtain those two. And they're now sensing that this is not an option, this is a necessity, that this is vital. In other words, if Texas is to survive, for example, the attempt of Mexico to regain Texas, or is it going to develop an economy? Well, the United States is the best bet, of course, particularly because Texas was experiencing now a more devalued currency. They're printing money, okay, and they're trying to use that printed money to pay for their expenses. But as they're printing in more money, they're creating, of course, inflation, okay, in Texas. And what inflation does is that it devalues the currency. It makes the commodities, the products more expensive. There's also the issue of the public debt. Okay, it's in debt. The Texas state, the Texas Republic is in debt. There's a public debt to repay. That will be easier to repay it if they simply be annexed into the United States. It will be easier. And also the threat, again, of Mexico and the Indian hostilities, of course, the Cherokees and other Indian groups. It's not just the Cherokees in the alliance with Mexico, but the Comanches as well. They continue to be in open hostility with the peoples of Texas, that the Texas citizens feel that what we need instead, again, is pretty much, again, to, consider or annexation, more seriously. Um, Although there were people that were entertaining grand visions of a Texas republic, an independent nation, et cetera, that will be very prosperous, et cetera, well developed, that is going to be well positioned to be dealing with trade with the United States and Europe, et cetera, that they just didn't need anybody. Of course, there were people that thought that way, but now there's those pressures, financial pressures, security pressures, and the like. And of course, like I said, there was a great number of peoples in Texas that desire annexation, and precisely because there's a connection, of course, with the United States, because the vast majority of the population of Texas were Americans that colonized this region. Okay, so there are certain emotional ties, there are cultural ties, with the United States, and they simply see that this is going to be inevitable, so to speak. So there were attempts very early on, something I mentioned in session 2, by Texas to be annexed into the Union. There were 3 petitions sent in 1836, 37, 38, year by year. The Texas Republic wants to be annexed, but it was really the U.S. Congress that was delaying annexation. Okay, so Texas was already willing to be annexed, but this motion was halted by the members of Congress because, particularly again, there are internal problems in the United States that made annexation quite, difficult. For example, there's an economic depression in the United States from 1836 to 1840. It's a 4-year period in which, again, the United States was, experiencing a depression, and it slowed down the economy and made people be far more concerned with the economy than being so much concerned with annexing extra territories, which, by the way, Texas was simply going to request, of course, the assistance, the financial, economic assistance of the United States to solve the finances of Texas, the public debt, for example, extend protection to the residents of Texas from, Mexico or the Indian hostilities, etc. So that would require, economic investment. You're going to drain your treasury in a new state because you need to assist it, of course. So that delayed annexation because of economic circumstances were not prime at this time, but also because the members of Congress were also very much divided politically, again, on the issue of slavery. Texas was applying to the Union as a slave state. It had actually legalized slavery in the Texas Constitution, the Texas Republic, and the Texas Republic simply wanted the annexation to take place in this context that we're going to come in. We want to come in as a new state, but we have slavery again as an institution is legal here, and we want to, to honor it. We want to become a slave state, that is to say. So that divided members of Congress, and there's going to be a lot of heated, passionate, arguments and debates in the halls of Congress back and forth regarding Texas. There's pro-slavery members of Congress, most of whom actually come from the South, again, from the southern states, the slave states, and there's the anti-slavery, of course, representatives from the northern states. The northern states are already abolishing slavery in their states' constitutions. So there's that. Again, the northern states desire Texas as well. That's for sure. But they want Texas to be free. They don't want slaves in Texas because that is going to take away a lot of jobs that Americans want. Again, they're jobs that Americans want to do for wages, that is to say. Okay, they want to earn wages, and they also want land for farming, which is available, by the way. But With slavery, what that meant is that the slave owners were going to dominate the politics of the state, and also they were going to dominate the best land for cotton agriculture, and of course, the economy. All of the jobs are going to be done by slaves, because why would you pay anybody, again, a wage to do something that somebody can do that for free? Okay, so the northern states, the people living in the north, don't want Texas to be a slave state. They want, again, a free state. So again, they're beginning to divide themselves politically between the Democrats and the Whig Party. Both represented the different positions. Again, the Democrats were the southern states. The southern states were now endorsing the Democratic Party to defend slavery. Okay, that was the pro-slavery party, the Democrat, again, the Democratic Party. And the Northerners were, at this point, also fostering the development of another party called the Whig Party. And that represented the views, the interest of the North, the anti-slavery views in this case. They wanted, a nation of manufacturing. They wanted a nation of commerce and a nation of free labor, they call it, that would provide jobs for people and economic opportunities. Again, a more modern society, if you will. So that, of course, Congress was really divided between those two parties. That delayed annexation because there's no agreement, okay, between those two. Every time they discussed annexation of Texas, it got into a heated debate, and there was no consensus. There was no agreement between the two parties in Congress. Okay, so by the 1843, 1844, members of Congress are going to reconsider their position, particularly their position regarding slavery when it came to Texas. And they started really now considering more seriously moving towards annexation, even though that Texas was going to come into the Union as a slave state, because they believed that Texas itself, despite the fact that it was a slave state, by the way, that it was located in a very strategic geographical location. In terms of trade, that is to say. So they're beginning to say, well, again, yeah, the issue of slavery is important, but what's also important is that if Texas becomes part of the Union, if Texas becomes part of the United States, states is going to have a great advantage, in terms of international trade, because Texas is going to connect the United States with the Far East, then the Asian trade, goods that are coming from China particularly, again, can be brought much faster, through the Pacific Ocean than, through the Atlantic Ocean, and so Chinese products, Chinese goods can simply come to the West Coast, and from the West Coast, there's going to be a trail that's called the Santa Fe Trail that is going to connect, that Asian trade through Texas into the United States. So they're beginning to say that, well, slavery is important, but also trade is important. So why don't just move ahead and actually, integrate Texas, even though it's going to be slave, but, the benefit here is the Asian trade. But there's other issues, again, that convince congressmen that they need to set their ideological differences aside and consider annexation, because Great Britain was already suggesting that it wanted to wanted Texas for Great Britain. In other words, Great Britain wanted to exert some control in Texas, perhaps create, a colony, and Texas will become part of Great Britain, for example. There were talks about that, just like Canada is part of Great Britain, still a colony, even though they're not colonies. They're called protectorates, part of the Commonwealth, okay, the Commonwealth of Great Britain. They're not called colonies, but again, there was also the talks are underway that the peoples of Texas are also entertaining the thought that, well, if the U.S. doesn't want us, maybe Great Britain, again, this is another path for development. we get the British to assist us, protect us, give us finance, assistance, etc. Again, that's that. So that's also, again, an issue that is going to cause the congressmen to reconsider, rethink their position. And of course, the idea of manifest destiny. Americans believe that it was the destiny of the United States to expand all the way to the West Coast. There's an ideology, there's almost like a religious belief among Americans during this time that they feel that the nation of the United States was created by God for the purpose of settling all of the land from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, and that this was going to become a great nation. It's called manifest destiny. And that also was influencing, inspiring the members of Congress. Many of them are feeling that, well, let's annex Texas because this is our destiny. This is the destiny that God gave to the United States to expand all the way to the West Coast, and Texas is part of this process. So they were also influenced again by this idea of manifest destiny. And again, in the election of 1844, this idea of manifest destiny is actually going to be used in the presidential campaign of 1844, in which one of the candidates, James K. Polk, is going to run on this slogan, again, of manifest destiny. The slogan was, we need to annex Texas because this is the destiny, this is the divine plan, in other words, that God gave to the United States. That God has a divine plan, the destiny of nations. Every nation has been given a destiny by God to fulfill, and this is part of our destiny, in other words. So I'm running on this promise that if I'm elected, that we're simply going to annex Texas. That's a promise, in other words, and this is going to be, making possible this destiny. In other words, we're going to fulfill the promise of God, to expand all the way to the West Coast. And of course, the issue of the Asian trade is there as well. The fear of Great Britain, annexing Texas, all of that will combine in this presidential election to convince the members of Congress that whenever James K. Polk was going to bring in a bill, an annexation bill, to Congress, that they were simply going to be moving forward with annexation. Of course, that's exactly what happened in 1845. After he becomes elected, an annexation bill is introduced in Congress, and on December of 1845, finally, this bill was passed, by the members of Congress, and we're going to see that even though there's not going to be an overwhelming majority of the representatives and senators that are going to agree, it was a relative majority that, with that, of course, we're going to see now Texas becoming now part of the Union, which indeed this is going to set off, of course, conflict with Mexico, because as I said, Mexico does not recognize the independence of Texas. So from the perspective of Mexico, the annexation of Texas was not legitimate. It was not valid. This was the United States simply annexing, a territory of Mexico. And of course, this is going to lead to tensions between the two countries, of course, over particularly the issue of Texas independence, but also the border itself. Where is the border between Texas and Mexico? That is going to be the spark of the Mexican-American War. The spark of the war itself will be the boundary itself, the boundary dispute of the Texas border. That the two countries have two different claims, two different maps about the boundary, and those differences are going to be disputed by the two countries, and this is going to ignite the war itself. That lasted for about 2 or 3 years from at the end of 1845, of course. This is the end of 1845, all the way to 1848. Okay, so like I said, Mexico does not recognize the annexation of Texas. Okay, this is not recognize it, period. Okay, so therefore, still at this point, Mexico considers Texas part of Mexico. And the United States likewise considered Texas part of the United States. Both nations claim Texas as to be part of their own state. Okay, and like I said, it was the issue of the boundary itself. Where is really the boundary that divides Texas and the other states of Mexico? From the perspective of Mexico, Texas is another state. You know, it's part of Mexico. But what is the boundary that divides Texas from the other states to the south? In other words, that is going to be the issue, of course, because the United States claims that is the Rio Grande River that divides Texas and Mexico, they said. Okay, it says no, Texas is part of the United States, and the Rio Grande is actually the dividing line. This is the political boundary of the two countries, whereas Mexico claims that the boundary is farther to the north of the Rio Grande River in a river called the Nueces River. Again, and how they arrived to this claim, how Mexico actually is able to claim this is because Spain actually, that this is the European empire that actually colonized, again, all this region. Again, they colonized Texas, New Mexico, etc., all of that. Again, we covered that in the previous topic. So it is really Spain that actually signed a treaty with the United States in 1819 to determine the boundary between the Texas province, okay, the province of Texas, that is a colony of Spain, and the new territory that the United States has just purchased from France, called the Louisiana Territory, that is just neighbors with Texas. And so, again, this is the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. In 1803, the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million. So again, we got Louisiana, used to be French, now it's American after 1803. And we got, of course, Spanish Texas to the west. And of course, in that treaty, there was a meeting of officials. One was, of course, John Quincy Adams, and of course, the Minister Onís, that are going to meet and actually use maps in order to divide the boundary between Louisiana, that is now American, again, U.S. Louisiana, and Spanish Texas, and also the southern border, again, the border that divides the Texas province from Tamaulipas, for example, the other province to the south. Again, so in 1819, this is what the Adams and Onís Treaty indicated that Texas was. Texas was simply this territory that you see here in light gray. Okay, this is what Spain considered to be the Texas province. And all of this area in dark blue was considered to be the province of New Mexico. It was called New Mexico in this case. Again, all of this province, again, is New Mexico, and this was considered Texas. This is the river that divided Louisiana from Texas, called the Sabine River. There's a river that actually divides Louisiana and Texas. It says, okay, look, this is the boundary that divides Louisiana, part of the United States, and the Spanish province of Texas. And to the south, what really divides the Texas province from New Mexico is going to be a river that is called the Nueces River. Okay, the Nueces River is pretty much this river that flows across this region all the way to what today is perhaps Corpus Christi. So Texas was simply this confined territory, if you will, according to the Adams-Onís Treaty. So therefore, Mexico claims in 1845 again that, and it has claimed that ever since Santa Anna, of course, was defeated by Sam Houston in the Texas independence in 1836, is that what Santa Anna and the government of Mexico, using this Adam-Onis Treaty of 1819, says no. The boundary of Texas is the Nueces River. This is Texas, okay, and all of this is New Mexico, okay, and the Rio Grande again is not really the border between Texas um, and Mexico, because all this strip of land, the Rio Grande Valley, okay, all of this region right here is not part of Texas. This is exactly what, again, Mexico is claiming. So this is going to become what is called no man's land, land disputed by the United States and Mexico now. Now that Texas is part of the Union, this is a land that both countries are going to dispute. Again, you can see here in this map, okay, this is a land, again, the Rio Grande Valley, from Brownsville, Matamoros, Brownsville, all the way to Corpus, moving up, to present-day San Antonio, etc., all across this region. This is going to be a land disputed by Mexican forces and American forces now, because both nations claim that this is part, again, of their own country. And of course, the United States is really going by not the Adam-Onis Treaty of 1819, but rather is using the Treaty of Velasco. This is the treaty that Santa Anna signed in 1836 when he was defeated. When he was defeated by Sam Houston, Sam Houston pretty much indicated that the border of Texas was going to be the Rio Grande, not the Nueces. So Mexico is using the Adam-Onis Treaty of 1819, signed by Spain and the United States, as proof that is the Nueces River, that is the border, and the United States is using the Treaty of Velasco, again, that Sam Houston actually obtained the recognition of independence from Santa Anna, to say, no, it is the Rio Grande River that is the border. Again, so it becomes a highly contested territory by both nations, and both nations, of course, are going to reassert their sovereignty of this region by moving troops, again, in the Rio Grande River, in the Rio Grande Valley. Mexican troops are going to be sent to cross the Rio Grande River and move to the north into Texas, what is considered to be, of course, by the United States as Texas, because Mexico says, no, this is still part of Mexico, the Nueces River that we need to be concerned with. And of course, as Mexican troops are sent into the city of the town of Matamoros, that is the border right now with Brownsville, Texas, on the very southeastern side of Texas, they're going to cross into the other side, the Mexican troops. They're going to, as the Mexican troops are moving to the north, they're going to engage with American forces that are already present there, because the Americans are beginning to establish their presence by building a series of forts. For example, Fort Brown. This is where we get, again, the name of Brownsville. It was a military fort that the United States was building there. And of course, as Mexican troops cross from Matamoros into now this region, they're going to encounter the troops at Fort Brown, and there's going to be a clash there, again, between the Mexican and American forces. There's going to be a scrimmage. They're going to be fighting there. And it seemed that the war had already started, in other words. So this actually led President Polk to ask Congress for a declaration of war, because they were already fighting. Again, there's already, again, a very highly contested region in which the two sides are already engaged in fighting. So that really, again, moved the United States towards a declaration of war. Congress declared war on Mexico. And with that, of course, the Mexican-American War begins. So it's going to be a very short war, spanned for about 2 years or so. So the Mexican-American War, we're not really going to spend a lot of time, just the essentials here. And that is, Mexico was not prepared or well equipped to fight a war at this time, as we'll see. So Mexico is not very well organized. There's no national unity to speak of. Again, in Mexico itself, the people are still very much divided between the conservatives and the liberals, and there's a lot of fighting, political instability. There's even insurrections that had emerged during the Santa Anna regime that we talked about, of course. So Mexico is in no position to be fighting, of course, but is going to now get involved again in this war called the Mexican-American War, of course. So Americans are going to move quite swiftly into the country of Mexico. Some forces are moving through New Mexico proper in California. Again, there's American forces that are going to be moving into Mexico proper, again, from the north, particularly from New Mexico. And from California, we're going to see, of course, Americans, of course, moving now into Mexican territory. And once again, this is not, again, a populated country to speak of at this time. There's no military technology that can compete with the technology of the United States. And there's, of course, a lot of political divisions as well. Of course, so there's going to be, of course, forces also moving through Southeast Texas as well into Mexico itself, from Matamoros and from the Rio Grande. Of course, we're going to see also Americans coming into the north part of Mexico. And again, General Zachary Taylor, who was the one that was actually confronting the Mexican troops at Fort Brown, is going to be marching south into Mexico, and the idea is to capture the capital. Again, this is how you win a war. All you do is try to capture the capital city of the country to bring about the surrender, again, of the country. And of course, there's also going to be an invasion coming from the Gulf of Mexico. Americans are going to be moving also some ships, some divisions into the port of Veracruz, in order to land there and now move troops towards Mexico City. So that's the idea. You're moving troops from the north, but you're also moving troops from the Gulf of Mexico as well. Okay, so this was happening quite quickly again. This is not going to be a prolonged conflict. The Americans are simply just moving quite quickly across the Mexican countryside, because it's still a rural countryside, rural society. And they encounter, of course, plenty of political divisions. It's not that they're not going to encounter resistance. There's going to be, of course, fighting between the Mexican troops and also the American soldiers. But in many cases, there are going to be regions that refuse to fight because the present government was liberal, they said. So we're conservatives, and we don't want to fight for a conservative. If the government was liberal and they were conservatives, they did not want to actually support a liberal government. Okay, something they will say. If the governor happened to be conservative and the population was liberal, they did not want to support the governor because he was from a different ideology. Okay, he was embracing a different, program, reforms, etc. So that was the situation. And at some point, the Catholic Church in Mexico was willing to side with the United States at this point if the United States was going to protect the church and the conservatives. So that is the situation again, that it was just mind-boggling to learn that Mexicans in this case were so much divided ideologically, and some of them were even, willing to collaborate or side with the Americans, like, of course, the Catholic Church, for example. Mexican generals were even fighting each other because some Mexican generals were conservative, some others were liberal. And there were, of course, desertions. There were, of course, soldiers that were deserting at high numbers in the Mexican army. It was a high rate of desertions. They were simply abandoning their ranks, leaving because many of them were forced to join the army. They were forced to, to join the cause for fighting the Americans, and many of them did not feel any connection to the Mexican state, and they simply left, of course, the army at alarming numbers. However, the true, of course, fighting that the Americans are going to face was not necessarily fighting the Mexican army in a kind of obvious formations in which you confront the enemy lines, you fight them, etc. But it was more like street fighting. As Americans enter a city, they're going to be, of course, the population turning against them. There's going to be, again, a lot of hostilities, what is called guerrilla warfare, hit and run tactics, again, that Americans are going to confront, again, a very hostile population. It was, again, a very divided, political scene, if you will. It is true. The army was also divided. There was a lot of fighting between them, but the population, the civilian population, just in general, as Americans walk in, they're going to turn against the Americans, and there's going to be a lot of street fighting taking place, of course. Like I said, the conservatives and the church actually sided with the Americans during the war in order to ask for the assistance, again, of the United States to protect, of course, certain interests, the church land holdings, for example, the large hacendados with their, large private, estates that they own, etc. They want protection, of course, from the liberals. They want the United States to protect them from the liberals in this case. So at any rate, the war is going to come to an end quite quickly when General Winfield Scott comes through the port of Veracruz in 1847. He marches towards the capital city, Mexico City. And by 1847, of course, the Mexico City is now under the control of General Winfield Scott, and it again brings the Mexican-American War to the end. Again, this is the end of the war itself. Even though there's a state of hostility again across the civilian population all over the country, of course, there's uprisings. There's a very hostile civilian population. That they're going to continue with the street fighting, of course, for many, many, many months to come. But this is the end, again, of the Mexican-American War. Mexico City surrenders, and with that, of course, there's no other route, there's no other option, just because almost in the same months when Americans are in Mexico City, there's now another rebellion taking place in Mexico, in the Yucatan, of course. It's called the Caste War, a massive rebellion and uprising taking place in the entire Yucatan Peninsula. But this is going to overwhelm, of course, Mexico's Mexican politicians, that they realize that this is a lost cause. Even if they wanted to continue fighting, they still have this new rebellion taking place in Yucatan called the Caste War. That is going to last for a few decades, by the way. The Caste War started about 1847-48, and this really placed an intense pressure on the Mexican leaders to surrender, that there's no other option but to surrender and sign the peace treaty with the United States called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848. Again, in this Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico actually cedes the entire American Southwest, what is today considered the American Southwest, was called New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, California, Utah, Nevada. All of that land that used to be part of the northern frontier of the Mexican state is ceded to the United States, and the United States actually paid Mexico $15 million for all of that land, which, by the way, from the perspective of Mexican politicians, and a lot of Mexicans, by the way, they considered this land to be totally barren and useless. The perception in Mexico City and the peoples of Mexico is that this land that you see here, the Mexican cession, was with the only exception of California. That's the only exception. But the other regions is just, they said, desert, rocky mountains, the rocky soil, barren land. You cannot really produce anything here. Again, it's just desert. So they just simply, again, pretty much ceded, gave away this land again in 1848 to the United States. So the United States is now annexing, of course, additional territories from Mexico. Okay, it established also the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the Rio Grande River. Okay, Rio Grande as the Texas border, again, that divides Texas and Mexico. And of course, it grants citizenship to the Mexican population that decides to stay in the new U.S. territories, that they are going to be given the option to leave towards Mexico. Those that, those peoples that live in this territory that want to go to Mexico, they can do so. But if you stay, they are going to be, considered U.S. citizens. About 100,000 again. It was the Mexican population that is going to decide to stay. A great many, not all of them, but there will be some that are going to actually move towards Mexico and move south again. So the legacy of the war is that Mexico lost 50% of its territory in this war. 50% of the national territory is lost, from Mexico. And of course, it stirred nationalism in Mexico. Man, there's going to be the sense of nationalism in Mexico, because what the war did was, again, for Mexico, is that it defeated Mexico. Mexicans are going to learn that this defeat was caused by divisions and internal strifes. And of course, they were, forced to surrender territories. And there's going to be now a sense of growing more national unity among Mexicans in the field of national pride. They want to actually heal this past, grievance, if you will. The Indian tribes now of this region, again, from Texas all the way to California, will become now part of the United States. So the United States is going to now develop, of course, their own policies towards the Indian population living in this region. Something we're going to see just in a few moments. And also the need for a transcontinental railroad in the United States. Again, this is the other legacy, is that there's also going to be the need to actually build a railroad across this region to reach all the way to California. Again, this is part of the development that is going to connect Texas, in the future, now with California across this region through the development of a transcontinental railroad. Texas will be now connected, by the way, commercially with the Asian trade that we were discussing. And of course, in 1854, what we're going to see is additional lands that gets then purchased in 1854. That will be also ceded to Mexico. This region right here is also going to be ceded from Mexico to the U.S. as well. This came, of course, years after the defeat, of course, of Texas, again, in the Mexican-American War. Okay, so again, we got, of course, now, Texas becomes a state of the Union, but there's also, in addition to that, of course, all of the territories to the west, from Mexico to California, are now also part of the United States, and Texas will be now more integrated commercially, if you will, not only with the eastern states, again, of the country, but also with the western territories as well. Okay, so at any rate, so this part 3 is not going to take us, much time, but we have to assess again this process again when Texas becomes a state of the Union, all the way to the Civil War in 1860. Looking at the Texas economy, for example, Texas is going to, in this process of this transition towards a statehood, is going to continue with its rural economy, rural enterprises. In other words, those are not industrial, those are not necessarily, they're not manufacturing, but rather those are activities that take place in the countryside. That is to say, those are enterprises that take place in the countryside, such as, for example, farming. There's a massive expansion of farms taking place because there's going to be, of course, more people's coming into Texas, more Americans, and there's going to be more land being cleared, developed, and there's going to be additional farms. In fact, there's going to be an explosion of farms from 1,200, at the moment of annexation, all the way to 35,500 farms by 1860. Again, so this is a massive, expansion of farms, small family farms that we discussed again in session 2. What people are doing is growing their own food, particularly families growing things like corn, wheat, oats as well, vegetables, and in some regions of East Texas, we're going to see the German and French immigrants also involved in winemaking as well, making wine and trying to sell it on the market as well. They bring with them their own wine culture. Okay, so this is, again, those are primordial activities taking place that allow people to pretty much subsist from the land, to live off the land, that is to say. So there's an explosion of farms. There's plantation agriculture. We talked about plantations like cotton. Now there's also going to be sugar introduced in Texas, and rice as well. But cotton was the primary staple. It dominated, okay, the rural economy. So much so that we're also going to see an increase again of cotton production as well, that by the time of the Civil War in 1860, cotton in Texas was already reaching new heights, in which the cotton plantations were already producing 94,000 tons of cotton, again, by 1860. So there's a dramatic increase in cotton agriculture. Most of the cotton plantations are in the east side of Texas, whether the northeast and the coastal region, again, present day, for example, Houston, all of that region, again, filled with plantations, prime, territories, prime climate for cotton agriculture, for exports. And again, this is going to be the dominant, again, enterprise that are going to generate massive amounts of fortunes and wealth for the planter class of Texas. Again, so we got, of course, the independent farmer, of course, going about, growing their own food, but there's also the cotton, again, plantation owner that is also building massive, fortunes through this cotton exports as well. And of course, another rural enterprise is the cattle ranching. Of course, this is also, part of the culture now. Again, this is part of the culture itself of Texas that continues into this process of statehood. It's going to be also a massive expansion of ranches as well, because with more confidence, of course, Americans are coming now in great numbers to develop, of course, cattle ranches, particularly in the south part of Texas and the east section. Again, the eastern fringes, again, this is not really East Texas the way we understand it in the map today. But again, people are moving now to the east, present day Dallas, for example, that region, and they're clearing land, they're grazing cattle, there's an explosion of cattle ranches, so much so that we're going to see the rise of cattle ranching empires, okay, starting from this point onwards. The cattle ranches, the largest ranches perhaps in the nations, are going to flourish in Texas. The individuals that are going to build those empires, like Kinney, for example, Richard King, the King Ranch, the famous King Ranch in the Rio Grande Valley, for example, famous, and Kennedy Ranch, of course, are going to be gigantic. Again, they're going to be so massive that they're going to kind of pioneer what we call today industrial ranching, by the way. So Texas will become like a cattle ranching empire, if you will, again, for the United States. Again, this is massive. It's the terrain, the land, etc., the climate is prime for cattle ranching. Now, last but not least, let's talk about Texas society during the statehood. Texas society. All right. So the Society of Texas is going to um, be in, the population again is going to increase in a very significant way. There's going to be a demographic growth to the point that by 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, there's going to be already 604,000 peoples, again, according to the census, of course, taken in that year, again, living in Texas. Okay, so this is a dramatic increase, considering, of course, that by the time of Texas independence, there were about 40,000, roughly in 1836. Now, by 1860, there's 600,000 plus, again, people living in Texas. So let's look closely at, Texas society. How is it that we're going to see population increase? What kind of groups lived here, etc. And very briefly, how their lives were like. Okay, so immigration is key. Immigration is key to understand this population increase. Of course, there's going to be more Anglo-Americans arriving in great numbers, and they're coming particularly from two regions, more so than the other regions of the country. This doesn't mean that there's those only two regions are the ones, of course, the regions from which we see American immigration here, or migration, I should say now. But rather, it is that there's specific regions like the Lower South. The Lower South is all of the southern states, again, along the Gulf Coast, so to speak, from places like Florida, Virginia, the Carolinas, again, all the way to, again, Louisiana. Again, the Lower South. And most of the peoples coming from the Lower South established in the eastern section of Texas and also in the southeastern portions of Texas along the Gulf Coast. Again, the vast majority of them. Okay, there's also peoples coming from the Upper South. Those are the states such as Missouri, Kentucky, for example, that are also going to arrive at great numbers as well, to Texas, and they're going to settle in North Texas again. And again, this is pretty much the kind of the settlement pattern, if you will, that is taking place. There's also an increase of German immigrants coming, into Texas by 1850. There's already 11,500 Germans living in Texas, most of whom are located in a corridor that stretches particularly from Corpus Christi all the way to Austin, Texas. In this corridor, we're going to see, again, Germans establishing there. And of course, they're the ones introducing things like winemaking and the like. Again, they're also developing farms and the like, of course. There's also the Mexican Americans. Of course, it's a Mexican American population. And it is very important. By 1860, they comprised 23,000, again, peoples, most of whom live in the southern portion of Texas. Once again, Goliad, San Antonio, Laredo, the Mexican, the border with Mexico, all this region, the Rio Grande Valley, for example. Okay, this is the hub, if you will, of the Mexican American population. Now, the Mexican American population, of course, as they transition now to live in a different state, the Mexican population transition, if you look, for example, at the Mexican population in Texas, they transitioned from living in the Spanish Empire, previously back in the 1700s, to live in the Mexican Republic, once, it achieved independence from Spain, Mexico. Now, the residents of Texas, the Tejanos, were now living under Mexican rule, under the Mexican state. And then when Texas gained independence from Mexico, they live under the Texas Republic. And now they're living under the United States, of course, under the U.S. Constitution, American laws, etc., in a whole different state altogether. And they acquire a new identity. They're now Mexican Americans. Now they're considered Mexican Americans. And again, 23,000 of them by 1860. And it's precisely because of the independence process, the invasion of Santa Ana and the massacre of Americans in Goliad and El Alamo in San Antonio, that is going to actually cause difficulties for the Mexican American population in now the Texas state, in the U.S. Texas state, because now they bear the stigma of Santa Ana. In other words, there's going to be animosities against Mexicans precisely because of the massacres, of course, that Santa Ana did, as well as of course, the frictions with Mexico. Mexico, of course, creating instability in the Texas Republic with the Comanches, for example, the capturing of San Antonio, the capturing of the expeditions of Santa Fe and the Mier expeditions. And that simply, again, exacerbates, of course, the situation for the Mexican American population. Of course, the war with Mexico as well, of course. So what that did is that it created a very difficult situation for the Mexican Americans to accommodate to this new state, to the United States, when they bear the stigma of Mexico, particularly the stigma of Santa Ana. And that is seen, of course, with the loss of political power. They lose, political influence. They're ousted from the administration of the towns, for example, in San Antonio. Mexicans are not allowed to lead, of course, in the administration. And of course, a great many report also loss of lands. Even people that own a ranch or rancheria, they're losing, of course, also lands that belong to them, of course. But now there's a new administration, there's new laws, and they're losing, of course, influence again in the state of Texas because of that stigma I just as explained. And of course, there's also the constant accusations that the Mexicans are aiding the slaves escape again, because a great many of the slaves go south and go into Mexico, or they go into the border. Okay, slaves that escape, let's say, around the area of Houston or Galveston, around that area, again, with the cotton plantations, a great many of them actually flee to the south. They flee to the border. And there's also that stigma that maybe the Mexicans are the ones that are helping the slaves escape, and this constant occupations of that. Also, there's going to be problems, again, with the Mexican American population in terms of certain enterprises that Mexicans, the Mexican population dominated for many, many decades in the past, like, transportation, freight, for example, services, carrying cargo on ox carts, etc. They carry cargo from town to town, and they were pretty much well versed in that kind of transportation enterprise, if you will. And now Americans, of course, bring with them their own transportation services to Texas, and they feel that the Mexicans pose, a competition. And so in 1857, there's going to be, of course, a situation when Americans are beginning to try to displace the Mexicans, of course, in this type of service in an event that was called the Cart War of 1857. The Cart War, in which the American merchants, many of them were involved in those freight cargo services, are beginning to displace the Mexicans in many cases, again, through the use of force, etc. And that leads to conflict. And of course, this is known as the Cart War of 1857. Okay, so again, the population is not experiencing, if you will, a smooth transition into this new system, into this new Texas state, precisely because of the frictions, of course, they experience, again, with the Americans in this case. That, of course, there's all the situations I just explained, dealing with past experiences. That is posing a very difficult, transition for them. All right. So in 1860, there's going to be, of course, another moment when the Mexican American population is going to uh, create a conflict, if you will, with the Americans, particularly in the southern border. Again, present day, what today is called the Rio Grande Valley, present day Brownsville, for example, in that area, there's going to be an individual by the name of Juan Nepomuceno Cortina. I'm sorry, Nepomuceno Cortina, who was a rancher, a cattle rancher, Mexican, of course, that is going to feel that the Mexican American population of South Texas was not treated, with respect and dignity again by the newcomers. So at one point, he tried to intervene in the arrest of an individual, an elderly person, by a sheriff, and he's going to draw his gun and actually, shoot again the sheriff. Again, there's going to be shootings, and after that, he will become an outlaw. He's going to be pursued by the Texas Rangers, and he's going to be rallying the population in this region, cattle ranchers and other peoples, in order to rise up against the Americans in a war that was called the Cortina War of 1860, inciting, of course, the population to steal cattle from American cattle ranchers or to be hostile towards them, etc. So there's a state of hostility, if you will, in South Texas between the Mexican American population and, of course, the Americans. And many of the people in the region follow Cortina. It's called the Cortina War, by the way, and they see him not as a bandit, not as an outlaw, but rather as a rebel, or as a hero. They even going to write songs and legends on his name, because he was seen as a defender again of the Mexicans again in South Texas. Now, of course, this other group, the American Indians. The American Indians will constitute another significant group in Texas that is, of course, also experiencing significant change as they're adapting, of course, to a whole different reality. Because now, remember, one of the reasons why Texas, the Republic, petitioned annexation was because they needed the protection, again, from the United States regarding, of course, the Indian hostilities. So what the first order of business, so to speak, of the United States was to extend that protection to the peoples of Texas by building a series of military forts all across Texas. One line is going to be all across from north to south, from Tarrant County all the way to Eagle Pass, Texas, at the very border with Mexico. You can see this line again. This is a line that extended, once again, from Tarrant County all the way to the city of Eagle Pass. The town back then, it was just, again, it actually started as a fort, Fort Duncan, by the way. And of course, there's going to be a series of forts to fortify all of this region, because the Comanche, particularly the Comanche, were still very much hostile towards the peoples of Texas. And in order to provide protection to the peoples of Texas, most of whom live in the eastern side of Texas, the vast majority, again, of the Texas residents live in all this region. So again, the United States began to build a series of forts in order to protect the population living in the east side from the hostile Indians still living in open ranges, again, in the west, of course. So again, there's going to be, of course, a series of forts built in order to actually deal with the Indian hostilities. And of course, the other policy that the United States is going to implement here is bringing about the Indian Reservation in 1854. Again, the United States, with Texas, of course, is going to issue, certain policies to create two Indian reserves, the Brazos Reserve, to provide, of course, lands for farming, etc., to the northern tribes. And they're beginning to create their own farms, schools, They're raising animals, etc. Again, this is an Indian reserve called the Brazos Reserve, and also the Comanche. Of course, the Comanche Reserve will be yet another reservation that is going to, at least again, the intent was to invite the Comanches to live there, and so they can learn how to farm, etc., and live in a more sedentary life, to create villages, to create communities, because they were nomadic. Those were people that were moving from place to place, hunting. They were very hostile, very warlike. But the problem is that the Comanches refuse to abandon nomadic life. They don't want to abandon that lifestyle. They want to continue moving from place to place, hunting, etc., gathering, and the like. And they just resist to live in a confined community. They just don't want to be confined in a territory, unable to step outside of that territory. They just want to be willing to be moving anywhere they want, in other words. So there's a resistance to this acculturation process that the reservation was intended to be. Of course, they continue to raid farmsteads, again, farming settlements, farms, and the like. And of course, there's going to be, Texas Rangers, once again, trying to deal with the situation by engaging in military campaigns against the Comanches. And this kind of started another Comanche war with the Texas Rangers. That's the other thing, again, that the Comanches are not that willing, again, to move towards the reservation. And of course, by 1859, precisely because the Comanche wars reach new heights and they become very hostile, this is going to place an end to the reservation itself in 1859, because there's going to be a growing distrust against the Native American population, as people just couldn't differentiate between a Comanche and members of another tribe, for example. So even the reservations, like the Brazos Reserve, that were already people living there, creating their schools, etc., they're not going to be that well, embraced by the peoples of Texas, because there was always the thought, the fear that the Comanches were perhaps there and they were going to be raiding them at any time. So once again, there's going to be growing distrust, particularly when John Baylor decided to attack the more peaceful, the more settled natives that were in the Brazos Reserve. And with that attack, of course, that brings the end of the Indian reservation in Texas in 1859. And those Indian groups are going to be now moved towards Oklahoma, Indian Territory, in 1859, of course. So again, there's the situation with the Native American groups. And of course, women, okay? Women constituted another very important group during this time that is going to create, of course, women, a very unique, social grouping that develop their own, of course, social identity and character, okay? Marriage for women living in Texas, of course, was not really based on love matches of any kind. The women in Texas, for the most part, if they got married, were getting married based on survival. Economic survival was paramount. This is why they were getting married or getting together with a man. And it was also common to see interracial marriages. Women, again, will often, get together with, men that belong to different ethnicities, if you will. It was common to see that as well. That patriarchy, a male-dominated society still was, very well established in Texas. This is a male-dominated society that excluded women from voting, holding office. Women couldn't sit in juries, testify, or even preach. They decided to be a religious leader, in a community. They couldn't preach. Again, so it's still male-dominated, but nonetheless, women develop a very, very hard, kind of, character that they needed, of course, to bring out that harshness of them in order to survive this environment. Now, they were rugged, semi-independent. The Texas woman was pretty rugged, that was willing to dissolve unions, whenever they found it inconvenient or they experienced violence, etc. They simply dissolve unions and abandon their spouses quite easily, and in many cases adopted the male role of the frontier. What males did in the frontier, like hunting and farming, ranching, and even fighting, this is something that women needed to do as well to defend themselves and survive in this environment. So they were very rugged and semi-independent in that sense. Many of them actually carried guns, concealed, if you will. Okay, but they had to, because there were so many dangers all around them. This is a kind of frontier society. And the last group I want to talk about are blacks, of course. This is the fastest growing social group that grew from 58,000 in 1850. In only 10 years, by 1860, there were 182,566 blacks, most of whom, of course, are African slaves. Because in the Constitution of Texas, as it joined the Union in 1845, slavery was introduced again in the Constitution. Slaves were considered property, capital. Those were taxable assets as well. Again, and of course, they couldn't get married, form families, for example. They couldn't bear arms. They couldn't assemble in the public assembly, for example, or testify in court. Okay, so that was the legality, again, of slavery in Texas, and this is what the law indicated back during this time. But nonetheless, the slaves did develop a social identity for themselves, forming their own informal families inside of the plantation. They were getting married on private ceremonies, for example, because through the family, they found, of course, comfort and mutual support. They supported each other in that situation, again, which is bondage, and they needed the love, the affection, the nurturing from their spouses, from their children, and this created, of course, a sense of belonging, that kind of, made them bear the burden, if you will, of their status as slaves, enabled them to do so. Of course, there was resistance, of course. Slaves resisted constantly by sabotaging work, like foot dragging. Okay, they will take days to perform a simple task, for example, or they will break tools. They will fake to be, ill, in order not to actually go to the fields or do some work, etc. They will burn barns in many cases out of anger or resentment, if you will, slaughter the master's animals, or even escaping. That's the ultimate form of resistance, simply escaping, of course. However, nonetheless, again, there's also going to be other forms of resistance that included also, resisting or defying the masters. There were no rebellions during this time. There were no open rebellions, but there was always the fear of the slave revolts in Texas, so much so that in 1860, for example, the peoples of Texas believed that many of the catastrophes that happened, such as the wildfires in Dallas and Fort Worth area, that is called the Texas Troubles, they said. There's Texas Troubles, they said. Now, some episodes or catastrophes, calamities, for example. The wildfires, they believe that those to be, of course, produced by a slave insurrection, that those were done by slaves that were in cahoots with the abolitionists, the white abolitionists, and there were accusations in which at least 10 white abolitionists and 30 slaves were actually accused of actually creating the wildfires. There was actually droughts, by the way, during those years. It was so dry, again, the soil, etc., that it actually produced, of course, the fires. But nonetheless, again, this actually leads to a state of mistrust, if you will, that, many of the peoples of Texas believe that this was, of course, a slave insurrection. Okay, so that's all I have for you. This is the end. This is the end of This is the end of this particular topic, calling again, it's Texas from nationhood to statehood. This is the end. The following topic, we're going to start actually the sixth topic on the Civil War and Reconstruction. This is something that will come next after this. Thank you.